Welcome to my third talk in the On Leadership series. In this talk, I divert from the traditional approaches used in developing leaders, which for many companies and organizations have largely centered on leadership development at the macro level. Instead, I introduce approaches for unveiling and developing hidden leadership attributes at the micro level, that is, the level of the individual. My premise is that in any organization, it is possible to extract leadership strengths from individuals by presenting clear leadership philosophies and establishing a corporate culture that embraces these philosophies and integrates them into everyday work. I hope you enjoy this journey with me. I begin with brief insight into how leadership is perceived today. I then introduce 4 broad leadership philosophies and speak to how each one, if practiced adequately, can be a gateway to unveiling an individual's leadership influence and ability. As usual, I will end with a few closing remarks. Let's get started. So what is leadership? Before we go there, let's take a look at what's happening today. We live in an era in which the demand for leadership greatly exceeds the supply. Signs of this imbalance are everywhere. Almost every issue of the Wall Street Journal, for instance, carries news about a major corporation bringing in top executives from outside the organization. We also see that executive search firms are flourishing because of the demand for leadership talent. What's more is that organizations are offering 6-figure starting salaries just to make sure they get the best and the brightest. All these overly aggressive attempts to recruit from outside the company could suggest that the leadership pipeline may be inadequate. Internal training, mentoring, or other development programs, for instance, are not keeping the pipeline full, making it necessary to look outside. The problem today is that there are only so many full-performing leaders to go around, and it seems that everyone is fighting over a relatively small group of stars. What is needed today is an approach that would allow organizations to keep their internal leadership pipelines full and flowing. Of course, this is easier said than done, especially because the requirements of leadership have dramatically changed. We need a new way to think about leadership. We want an approach that takes into account the different requirements at distinct leadership levels. We need to separate the practice of leading through influence from the mundane structural construct of a leadership position. We should seek to define clear philosophies around leadership that together form a set of cultural norms which underline day-to-day business practice. I will now proceed to introduce 4 general philosophies on leadership, and I will attempt to shine a light on how each one, when implemented at the level of an individual, can help propel a person's degree of influence. Let's look at the 4 leadership philosophies that I introduce in this course, along with their respective central themes. First, engage and be engaged. This speaks to how to connect and form strong professional relationships. Secondly, simplicity is power. This philosophy offers insight into how simplifying the complex can strengthen influence. Third, the power of mental attitude. This emphasizes that only you control your ability to project a positive mindset. And lastly, the significance of one, a philosophy that recognizes that leadership begins with you. Let's now explore each philosophy from the perspective of how it enhances leadership. The first philosophy on leadership that I wish to present is to engage or be engaged. The term engage invokes a sense of proactive outreach to connect to an entity. And if expressed differently, be engaged returns a feeling of being already intrinsically engulfed in that connection. In any workplace, for instance, when one thinks of employee engagement, it is instinctive to ask, to what entity does one need to show connection? Or if expressed differently, what is the target of this engagement? The answer may vary considerably and could include targets such as company mission or vision, the customer or customer service, or even one's peer group or work team. The notion of employee engagement can unfortunately be perceived by some as an arduous process of employee surveys, compounded by a protracted regurgitation of survey results, with little sense of how information from these surveys can be implemented at the level of the individual to yield positive impact and therefore affect the organization more broadly. To this end, employee engagement, when considered without purpose and structure, can indeed be a farce. Such broad-brush engagement targets, as viable as they may be at an organizational level, necessitate the ability to first engage at an individual level, and in turn, command individual ownership of the responsibility to connect to the target of that engagement. Let's explore how to successfully apply this philosophy. In their book, Closing the Engagement Gap, Gebauer and Lohmann define 5 interrelated courses of action that help organizations increase engagement and ultimately performance and competitive advantage. The focus in their book was solely at the organizational level. Unfortunately, there remains no consistent approach to cultivating the ability to engage at the level of the individual. I attempt here to repurpose the action areas introduced by Gebauer and Lohmann as a means of presenting an approach for achieving engagement at the level of the individual. I do so by refocusing the central tenet behind their 5 actions towards the individual as follows: know yourself and others, grow yourself and others, inspire yourself and others, involve yourself in others, and reward yourself and others. To complete my reconstruction and direct it to apply to the individual, I posit a narrative for each action, with the hope that some may find value in my rationalization. The first action area, know yourself and others, hinges on having a decent grasp of your individual strengths and insecurities, while consciously seeking to understand same about individuals with whom you interact. By better knowing how to manage your own strengths and vulnerabilities, and deliberately paying attention to these key attributes in others, you establish a platform that allows you to connect on common ground, both constructively and with compassion. Secondly, growing yourself and others speaks to the need to acknowledge and take action on your areas of development, while seeking positive ways to empower others to do the same. Being open-minded and having the willingness to think and delve boldly beyond your innate comfort space are paramount. You need to nurture the passion for learning, and this will fashion creativity, opportunity, and personal growth. That subtle ability to influence others even without confirmed authority, forms the central idea behind the third action area: inspire yourself and others. To inspire requires that you seek out and accentuate the positive way forward, but always accord credence to the veracity of the challenge at hand by being pragmatic and objective. The fourth action, involve yourself and others, speaks to the need for hands-on participation and an unremitting fortitude to lead by example. Make a conscious effort to always be present in the moment. Lastly, but not least, and yet unequivocally obvious, is that generosity to self and others breeds rewarding interactions. Make sure to take time to revitalize yourself. In summary, the glue that drives the need for engagement is that at core, individuals do want to make a difference. The 5 actions I have introduced here for projecting engagement provide an effective tool that can help towards this end. Let's now move on to look at the second philosophy on leadership. I call this simplicity is power. Sir Francis Bacon, an English philosopher, statesman, and scientist, popularized the phrase, knowledge is power. The main idea behind this phrase rests on the notion that information precedes knowledge. This means that the more efficiently one could access information and distill it into knowledge, the more influential or powerful one could be. This phrase has rung true for over 400 years, but one wonders whether today it's losing its steam. In today's information-saturated world, where major advancements in technology have catapulted the ability to access information, as well as the speed at which information can be converted to knowledge, the path from knowledge to power has been clouded by the excessive and complex web of readily accessible knowledge. So much so that it's conceivable to redefine power as the ability to separate important knowledge from the rest. Put another way, power is the ability to simplify the complex web of knowledge. By extrapolation, therefore, this makes power synonymous with simplicity. So what value does this notion bring to us? In his book entitled Simplicity, the New Competitive Advantage, Bill Jensen remarks that simplicity is the art of making the complex clear, the power to do less of what doesn't matter and more of what does. All too often in our everyday work, we stress over multiple decision options or challenges that we face, both concrete, such as difficult actions we must take, and intangible, such as tough behavioral choices we must make that could influence an outcome. Not infrequently, however, we allow our misguided anxieties, our biases, and our personal insecurities to artificially inflate the perceived complexity of the decision options we face. In such situations, we coerce ourselves into choosing poorly, or sometimes simply retreat from taking a stand, as depicted in this cartoon. So how does one invoke the power of simplicity? What if we use our time differently to better organize and simplify what we know by separating fact from fiction, tangible from intangible, Could we then spend a lot less time stressing over things that do not matter and a lot more on things that do? In other words, by taking time to make the complex clear or simple, would we be better placed to drive the correct decision or make the right call? I believe each of us is empowered to make decisions within a complex maze of information and knowledge, and that the ability to simplify our options and disband the tangible from the intangible conjures the power to succeed. So, if simplicity is power, then simplify before taking action. Let's now turn to the next philosophy, the power of mental attitude. Each passing day, our professional lives are riddled with increasing challenges, personal conflicts, and upsets that impose severe strain on our persona. That is who we are and how we relate to and influence others. For many, there is an almost spellbound tendency to surrender to those negative feelings born from a sense of frustration, uncertainty about a path forward, or even from a complete erosion of self-confidence. Few people have mastered the art of shifting their perspective away from the negative subtext of their personal situation and instead focus their mind on transforming their challenge into opportunity. Seldom is there a silver bullet that will resolve every challenge, let alone a bullet over whose control one has sole jurisdiction to shape as deemed fit. What we do unequivocally possess is the power to choose whether to face our challenges with a positive mental attitude or not. There is vast and rich literature in the public domain on the concept of positive thinking, as well as reams of guidelines on how to cultivate this type of mental attitude. Much of this is becoming cliché and is somewhat viewed with increasing skepticism by those unversed in the basic parlance on this subject. My intention for this topic is not to regurgitate the do's and don'ts that already saturate the literature of positive thinking, but instead to prompt thinking around the fundamental question: how do I choose to act in the face of unrequited challenge? Napoleon Hill, in his book on the 17 Principles of Personal Achievement, boldly classifies all actions taken when faced with challenge as being a choice between two paths. One path is taking possession of your own mind and using it to get what you want, or alternatively, accepting the consequences of neglecting to control and direct your mind towards a worthwhile goal. Hill's classification, though intuitive as a general guidance, remains somewhat vague in its direction. It is not uncommon that difficult work challenges can leave a sense of despair, confusion, or discouragement, all of which are sentiments that can render an individual powerless and resigned. When faced with this circumstance, the question becomes, how does one overcome and regain their leadership drive? It may arise, for example, that you find yourself stretched far too thinly with work to the point of utter frustration. Or perhaps you may be struggling to work well with a difficult client or difficult colleague. Even worse, your self-confidence may be depleted if you do not achieve a reward that you had greatly desired. A common thread with each of these situations, and many others, is a perception, real or not, that an affliction has befallen you, much to your dismay, and leaving you perturbed, discouraged, frustrated, or even downright angry. It's certainly absurd to presume that one could think their way out of such affliction by simply and naively enunciating the principles of positive thinking. That said, however, to successfully navigate your way through these troubled waters would necessitate a proactive and intentional mental stance. I offer to you 3 simple steps that help to muscle up a positive mindset and open up a path out of this gloomy state. First, define a realistic goal, which will serve as an acceptable solution to perceived troubles. Second, fix your mind on the object of this goal as a way to separate fact from noise and to have clarity on what needs to be done. And lastly, act upon a plan to attain the goal. I believe these actions define the pillars of the type of mental attitude that can overcome the temptation to lapse into self-defeat, self-scrutiny, or self-pity. A positive mental attitude offers the wisdom to better understand yourself and others, and consequently paves the way to new possibility in the face of apparent despair. It is important to grasp that only you have complete control over your attitude and your mental fortitude. Now let's move on to the final leadership philosophy, the significance of one. Many Fortune 500 companies seek to achieve a top rating as a great place to work. They also push to project an external reputation as a company with highly talented staff. It is not surprising, therefore, that for many companies, their mantra accentuates the importance of developing leaders and thinkers among their staff. As exciting as this may seem at the periphery, there remains a superficial concern to overcome among the general populace within a company. This apparent hurdle is the underlying silent impression among many that there simply are not enough positions of leadership to go around, which could serve as a platform for unveiling and elevating one's leadership ability. As illustrated in this cartoon, for some, this belief, real or not, leads to self-imposed detachment and a debilitating resignation to not make the extra effort. What's wrong with this notion? Such belief emanates from the crippling misperception that leadership requires one to be in a certain role or job position. It leaves a false sense that lack of exposure to such roles or positions renders one an insignificant player in the grand scheme of leadership influence. This is what I call the counterfactual license to lead. The antidote that's needed to circumvent this debilitating notion is to have an unremitting appreciation of one's own individual significance. For some, this recognition is hindered by a plethora of reasons, such as lack of self-confidence, being risk-averse, a draining desire to be liked, or a pessimistic mindset that focuses on limitations instead of possibility. The question to be asked, therefore, is, How does one break these shackles of self-inhibition? I posit that it begins with an understanding of the basic precept in Rhonda Byrne's universal law of attraction. This law states that thoughts continually anchored in one's mind ultimately influence and often dictate one's individual circumstance. Put another way, having the right mindset and embracing the belief in one's own significance will offer an individual the confidence to propel their strengths, offer their opinions, and influence decisions around their individual circumstance, regardless of what role or position they hold. As a final thought on the subject of individual significance, or the significance of one, I wish to quote the philosopher and author Bob Proctor, who suggested that belief in oneself begins with adopting the right mindset. To this end, Proctor coined a phrase which I believe is quintessential to infusing a zest for individual drive. If you see it in your mind, you will hold it in your hand. We have come to the end of our third session in the On Leadership series. In this talk, I have introduced 4 general philosophies on leadership. I have delved into how they translate into actual actions that can help evolve your leadership impact, regardless of your position level in the corporate hierarchy. On the philosophy of engagement, I presented 5 behavioral traits that can help to strengthen your skill level in reaching out and connecting with others effectively. I introduced the second philosophy by explaining and exploring the synergy between simplicity and power. In the context of strengthening your influence through simplification, I highlighted the importance of separating the tangible from the intangible, and the need to focus more on what matters and less on what doesn't. I went on to discuss how the right mindset or mental attitude can shape a smooth exit from challenging situations. I emphasized the notion that regardless of situation, complete control over the type of attitude or mindset that you apply to address a situation rests solely with you, the individual. Finally, I brought to bear that leadership begins with a recognition of your own individual significance. And I offered you the motivating phrase, if you see it in your mind, you will hold it in your hand. It is my hope that you have found some value in this series. Before I leave, I offer the words of a most noble man, the 6th President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, who stated, "If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader." Thank you for your participation in the On Leadership series.